Hello everyone, what are we going to do today? We're going to take a look at the Lilithe Classica character. Her hip rig is kind of the reasonably good hip rig you might have seen from the Taida tutorial, but as it is missing an extension, I have since decided to add to the Monette, Taida, and Endeara Devika characters. So we're going to go ahead and add that to Lilithe Classica today. She's just a pretty simple character that I've got. If you would like to support my work, you might notice I don't have any advertisements, or I guess I do because YouTube sticks ads on everyone's videos, but I try my best to tell them don't put ads on my videos. So I'm making no money on this. If you want to support me, just go buy a character. You don't have to do anything, or if you want to learn, you can play along by pulling the character up and playing with Blender at the same time. So what do we got here? I've got two different layers I'm showing. The control bone layer, so that's if I grab a bone and move it around. But this isn't really the layer we're going to be playing with much today. We're going to be playing with this layer, which is where where I keep a lot of the constrained deforming bones. That would be bones like tendons and bones that rotate, especially whenever something else is going on. So what you will notice if you pull up Lilithe Classica by default, she'll be slightly different than this. There's two extra bones here. So let's go into edit mode and look at what those are. So this bone is already there. It's defaulting. This bone is also there. It's also a default. What I'm doing is adding two more bones. And so I'm adding these bones. This bone here is connected to the hip bone, and it starts at the same place as this bone. This is the main new bone, and let's call it hip stretch target L. That's what this bone is. So this bone needs to start from where this one originally stretched to. This is the hip front correct, which is there's actually a tendon there. I don't know the name of the tendon, so I call this. Sorry. So this bone originally was stretching to the hip bone, and I believe if we go back into pose mode here, I've already changed it so it doesn't stretch to the hip anymore. It stretches to this hip stretch target L, which is this bone right here. That's that new bone I was just mentioning that we're going to add. It goes from down here, the end of where this is stretching, and up here behind and above the hip bone. All right, so that's the first bone you're going to add, and this bone is not a parent of anything. It's just kind of sitting there. It just happens to be where this bone ends. It kind of looks like this bone would be its parent, but it's disconnected, right? And you could actually create this by extruding this bone down here and disconnecting it, deleting all its drivers, deleting all its constraints, and then renaming it. But the other bone is this one here, which also is probably you can create by extruding this bone and doing the same, or I guess probably at that point duplicating this bone. Now both of these bones should not be children of what they were before. Right now I have them children of the hips move, which I may decide a little bit later is not right, but for now, however the hips move, I want this to move the same. And actually, I probably should make it a child of that. There is another bone that I use for moving the hips around, which I think is this def hip joint. Right now, I can move the hip joint around. Probably this one should be a child of that, so it can move with all the others. You see how these two gray bones here are not moving? So yeah, actually, let's make that a child of that. So I'm going to take this one, which right now is a child of control hips move, and this one, which is also a child of control hips move, and make them instead a child of def hip joint L. Yes, I think that is correct. So parent, keep offset, and then let's go back to pose mode. Let's grab this and move. Yep, sure enough, now those two gray bones are moving along. So that's probably how we want that. Okay, so then the other thing is this one originally was stretching to the hip, like I mentioned a little bit ago. Now it is stretching to this gray bone right here. If we look at the constraint on it, it stretches to there, head tail 0 right now. Right now 0, but what we want to do really is as her leg rotates, so let's take a look at this. As her leg rotates forward, oops, acted on it. We want that stretch to no longer stretch to the bottom anymore, but now start stretching to the top, right? So that is this one right here. It's stretching to there. Okay, well let's just go ahead and add that right now, shall we? Let's add a driver. We're going to make it be on the rotation of that hip, so we want that, which is called thigh, I believe in my case, so let's figure it out. So there's the rig, and it's going to be control thigh L. We want its X rotation. This is pretty common, that the rotation is like that on this rig. And we want that to be local space rotation. So right now it's not rotated, well, it's rotated a little bit, 4 degrees, so the value is quite low. And so the place it's going to stretch to is right down towards the bottom, which is kind of what we want. Then let's actually rotate this and see where it ends up. See, it is only rotated, it only started to stretch to about a third of the way up, so we probably want to take this and say, I don't know, var times, let's say times 3 and see what happens. It's still stretching all the way to the bottom. Why? Because x is, as I do this, it becomes more and more negative. So I want that to be negative var times, well, or just var times, let's say negative 3. But let's just make it -1 for the moment and see what happens. So we grab again her foot, we grab the place we want the foot to rotate around, we rotate it up. See, it's already gone all the way up to the top here with multiplying it by 1. And the question is that about right? Do we want that to go that quickly up to the top? So here it's already halfway up. Feels a little bit fast. I think I actually want this a little bit slower. I don't want it all the way up to the top so quickly. So let's take that formula and tweak it a bit. Let's make it times 0.8. Okay, it's still already at the top. Let's make it 0.5. Okay, so it moved down a little bit, so it's not all the way to the top yet. Let's take a look at, maybe I should get this thing going so that I can more quickly select things. Select her foot, select her inner hip here. So if I'm putting it down here, yeah, that feels about right. It doesn't look right because the other thing we're going to be doing is making the hip move up and down. Okay, so let's actually get on that right now. So if we make, what we want is this bone, the hip bone is connected to move slightly along with this bone. And so what we do is we highlight this bone and then this bone, and we do Control-Shift-C to copy the location. We want to copy the location in pose space, and we want the influence to be 0.25, which is about a quarter, and we want the head tail to be at the head. So when we're in the default pose, if we turn off the eyeball and turn it back on, it should barely move. And it is moving a little bit, which means I probably need to take this bone and move it a little bit back and down. And let's do that again. Okay, so it's barely moving, probably fine, right? Like you want to, in general, make sure that in your default pose that constraints aren't doing much. Otherwise, they'll change your character's shape just between edit mode and pose mode, which is like not your goal in life. Okay, we're only doing this on the left side. We're going to do all this on the right side in a bit. But so now let's take a look and see what that looks like. If we click the foot and we click the little control on the hip and we rotate it forward, see now her hip is moving up very slowly as her leg rotates forward. I feel like it's too far back. So I bet also what we want to do is take this gray bone here and tilt it forward. Let's look at this in various angles to make sure that's really right. Yeah, right. It seems like her hip is actually moving back as her leg comes up. We don't want the hip to move back. We want it to move forward. All this mass is going to get pushed forward, I think. So we know this is actually incorrect. And let's kind of look at the bones and see if we can understand like what's going on. Yeah, right. See, it's not moving forward. So I guess in other characters which had more massive hips, she's a much bonier girl. This, I guess, shouldn't be behind the hip. It should be in front of the hip. So let's take this, grab it, move it forward, and see what happens. Yeah, let's just move it forward. All right. So now if we grab her leg and rotate it, what happens? Yeah, so that's better, but now her hip bone is moving too much. So I think probably what we want to do is take this hip bone, deform her hip bone here, move it down so that the geometry that corresponds to her hip bone doesn't move as much. So we probably want to take this and move it down and move it back. Then the problem is once we've done that, we have to re-parent her mesh to the rig, and the reason for that is now the amount that this deforms should be less. Is there anything else there that even captures that? Yeah, I guess there's other bones that may capture some of that weight there. I feel like that also needs to go in a bit, and as in towards the center as opposed to towards the back. Okay, so now we're going to reparent this. Reparent with automatic weights is what I just chose. That is Alt P and then T, which does that. Okay, then let's take her leg and rotate it forward again. Oops, grab the wrong bone. Oh. Yeah, so I think what's going on here is I'm going to have to do more work on the hip because that hip is moving way too much. I think the reason why this looks good on the other characters is they were both weightier girls. This character being so bony, there's not as much mass here up around her hip bone, and so when I rotate this, or when I do the same sort of motion on her as I do with the others, it looks too much like the bone is moving and not like other mass there is moving. So I think what I want to do therefore is probably take this, not copy the location by nearly as much. So let's make that like 0.05, then let's rotate it and see what it looks like. Boy, howdy, it's hard to grab the right bone there. There we go. Okay, so now her hip bone moves, but only slightly. So this way, it looks like we're lucky. The amount that her hip moves, we can just change it and make it less, and it seems like that was fine. Okay, so let's actually look at these bones here while we're rotating it and see what that looks like. All right, the stretch 2 is moving from the bottom to the top of that thing, and it is, how much is that stretch 2? Is that stretch 2 still? Yeah, that should be more like 0.9 instead of 0.7. The reason why it needed to be 0.7 before is because it was going to a bone that didn't move. Now, because I'm having it move up and down this thing, it needs to be a different amount. And so let's just do this with the other one here while we're thinking of it. And actually, while we're here, let's take this driver, copy driver, and let's take it over here and paste it here. Paste driver. Now the problem is once you pasted it, Blender again isn't smart enough to change L's to R's, so you have to do that yourself. So that's changed to an R, and also it doesn't change negatives to positives. In this case, probably it doesn't matter if I take her right leg and rotate it forward. Yeah, see, it's moving up as you would expect, going up and down that mechanism bone the same way as it should. And I'm looking at this bone here, going up this bone here. As I rotate it, it does the right thing. So it looks like rotating in the negative X direction on the right leg is the same as the left leg. Sometimes that is not the case, and you have to take your drivers and change all your positives to negatives, etc. And I haven't really figured out the rules for that yet, so we are how we are. Okay, so looks like we have the basic concept figured out here. This starts from the bottom, moves up. This moves along with it, but only a little bit. We've moved this in and changed sort of the amount of influence it does on the hip, but probably the more important bit was just pulling it back into our body, therefore reducing the weight on the geometry. That's probably the main thing there. Well, I guess actually more important yet would even be how much we copied the influence of the position of this from from 0.25 down to 0.05. And so again, if you look at the other characters' hip rigs, that influence is more there. And again, that's because they're not as bony characters as this one is. So this is what's going on here. I think that actually is all we need. Let's actually poke around. So there is a pose all the way at the end here. This is the pose that we're looking at. What we wanted to do is see from this angle, does it dip down? It looks like it still dips down here. So why is that? Probably it looks like in this position, if we wanted this bone to not dip down and come up here, it looks like this bone needs to be, even this gray bone here that it's stretching to, it needs to be even higher and probably a bit back. Yeah, I think the problem is it needs to be much higher. Okay, so let's take this and move it up and back and even a bit further up. So yeah, I think even a bit further up. So where you want that actually is a fair bit above the hip bone as the geometry defines it. So our hip bone and the geometry is up here, right? Ignore the armature. The armature is doing deforms. It's not really where a bone would be. So the real hip bone would be up in here. So we want this above and behind that. So it looks like we probably want it way up here. Okay, so let's put it back here and take a look. Yep, sure enough, see now the geometry doesn't dip way down. It actually does kind of come up where it belongs. Let's look at it from some different angles. Here it looks a little weird, but possibly that would be the way it really is because her pubic bones are going to be pushing that geometry out here. This might have success already. I don't see anything really wrong with that. Okay, so let's now look and make sure we got everything copied across, right? So this new bone I added has no constraints, it has no drivers. Okay, so that's fine. We'll have to think about it on the other side, except I guess to make sure it also has no constraints. Yep, sure. So this bone that is stretching to, that's the one on the back side. This one that is stretching to it, 0.9 influence, I remember just a little bit ago copying that across. So yep, sure enough it is there. We'll copy the driver across, remember. Okay, so those are fine. Let's go back to the default pose. This is just a child of this bone now. This bone has 0.05, I'll bet I forgot to copy that influence across. So let's click this. We don't even have a driver on this one. Okay, so we have to take this driver and copy it from this bone. So what we do is copy the one that wants the constraint, click the bone that has this constraint, hit Control-C, and you can copy selected constraints. You want to copy the location. It's going to fuck everything up. Why is it going to fuck everything up? Because again, Blender doesn't change L's to R, so it changed that back to R. Everything goes good again. So now this one will be copying the location. If we rotate up her right leg, we should see everything working correctly. That bone is coming up. Her hip is moving ever so slightly. Yep, the hip moves very slightly. What happens if I, instead of copying it at 0.05, what happens if I copy it at 0.1? Let's just take a look and see. Does it look better, or does it do something that makes us think about what's happening in a different way? So it is moving that bone more. and that does make her hip move, or her hip bone geometry move a bit more. But does it look wrong? Does it look weird? Actually, that one looks fine. I kind of think I want it more than less. I think I really do want that hip geometry to move up a little bit more whenever her leg is coming up like that. Okay, so I'm going to grab this other one over here, change that also to the 0.1 to match the other side, then go to my test pose, which is where her leg is at. Just make sure that doesn't look any worse than before. I'm assuming it looks a little bit better. Yeah, it looks fine. We know 0.25 is too much, or is it too much? Because remember, I pulled her hip in and back quite a bit. What happens if I change this to 0.25 now? That maybe looks like it could be too much. Let's go back to the default pose and look at what happens when I rotate. Take this, rotate, yeah, that's too much. Look at that. It was fine in that pose, but just as she's doing this, that just looks ridiculous. So let's take this and put it back to 0.1. That's like less than half the influence of what it just was. Then let's see in this pose what things look like. Yeah, so her hip bone is moving up, but it's only moving enough that it kind of looks like the skin and muscle and tendon and all that kind of fat and stuff. And what I'm looking at is right here, right? Kind of actually looks like that's what's moving more so than the bone itself. So I think I'm good with 0.1. That is about fine. Let's go back to this test pose, take a look, all the angles. Yep, that looks pretty reasonable. So that solves that problem that we had before, where things come down there. And you might tweak it a bit more. In your character, maybe there's some other geometry that doesn't look good. You might end up having to move your bones around a little bit, change their influence, etc. I'm always doing that. Every character, even though a lot of my characters have a very similar look, they are definitely different, and I do have to tweak these bones quite a bit when I'm taking the rig and trying to match it to one of the other characters. This looks good. I'm going to call it a success and save it. All right, thanks all for watching. Have a good one.